delighted to introduce first up this morning to talk about the National Security Committee of Cabinet, a long-standing colleague and friend of mine, Peter Jennings, who has the distinction, I think, of recently being banned from both Russia and China. So congratulations, Peter, and stage is yours, my friend.
Thanks, David. Yes, banned in Russia and China, and not very popular in Canberra either, actually. So, well, good morning to you all, Mr. Howard. Great to see you here. Everyone's been rereading your biography, Lazarus Rising, and so that's the start of my talk about the National Security Committee of Cabinet. In his autobiography, Mr. Howard says that it was his intention after the '96 election to restore a fully functioning and orderly system of Cabinet government, with all the major decisions of Cabinet being made by Cabinet or properly functioning committees. And he went on to say, as promised, I established a National Security Committee of Cabinet, which was to have the task of dealing with all foreign affairs and defence issues. It was to prove one of the most successful administrative decisions I took. I thought an interesting line in an otherwise fairly realist, sort of quite modest assessment of your own time as Prime Minister. So I'm going to argue here that the Howard government's NSC, the National Security Committee, strengthened the Prime Minister's position over defence policy and international crisis management. And it's largely set the benchmark, for good or ill, about how subsequent governments have approached these issues. At its best, the NSC gave the Howard government a flexible mechanism to handle international crises and to steer defence policy decisions, at times against the advice of officials. At its worst, the NSC could be subject to groupthink. In some respects, I think the committee took on the personality of John Howard as the chair. It was an orderly, prose-driven clearinghouse for decisions, not given to extravagance or policy adventurism. Now, I need to confess some of my own involvement in the course of the NSC over the life of the Howard government. I was Chief of Staff to Defence Minister Ian McLaughlin from March '96 to October of '98, and in that I was quite closely involved in the NSC's working around the Sandlines crisis, which I'll talk about, with Papua New Guinea, and some early Defence Force deployments. And then as a defence official, I was closely involved in supporting the NSC's work on East Timor, stabilisation operations, and at a later point on the Iraq and Afghanistan conflict. And then finally, I was in Mr. Howard's office in the Cabinet Policy Unit, developing a strategic framework for full Cabinet, but also observing the work of the NSC in the lead up to the Iraq War. Now, success has many parents, but I'm going to claim a little bit of parentage for the National Security Committee as well, because I suggested that it should be created in something called A Strong Australia, Rebuilding Australia's Defence Capability, which was the defence policy statement produced by Alexander Downer and released by John Hewson in the lead up to the March 1993 election. And in the fight back tradition, A Strong Australia was a tome. It was a 183-page document. I remember at the time, actually, that we got wind that the press had received, I think, the executive summary of this document and was preparing to release it early. So Alexander took the decision that we needed to get this thing out in a hurry late on a Sunday afternoon. Ever since I see Alexander from that moment, he complains to me that the most comprehensive defence policy statement ever produced under an opposition from an opposition never actually had his name anywhere on the cover of the document. But what that document did was that it said it would establish a Cabinet Security Committee, and it complained about the fact that the Hawke and Keating governments had allowed that committee to fall into disuse. The Cabinet Security Committee, for example, not meeting to authorise the deployment of Australian forces to the Gulf War. So A Strong Australia 1993 said that we would create that. That was then repeated in the Coalition's 1996 election policy statement. And the NSC, as Howard structured it, gave more focus and attention of senior ministers and officials to policy work. Howard, as PM, chaired the meetings with the Deputy Prime Minister, Treasurer, Ministers for Defence and Foreign Affairs, and Attorney General attending. I think a particular benefit of the NSC was that it had on the other half of the Cabinet table relevant officials, secretaries of various departments, heads of the intelligence agencies, the Chief of Defence Force. And in particular, the benefit was this gave an opportunity for a more considered and informed discussion around policy issues before the ministers under Howard's direction were able to take decisions. In the early stages of a government, I think it always takes time for a government to find its feet. And to my mind, the breakthrough for the Howard government in working out how to actually move the levers of policy around defence and security was the sandlines crisis in Papua New Guinea. Now, just to briefly background you about that, frustrated with the inability of the Papua New Guinea Defence Force to quell a secessionist movement on Bougainville, Prime Minister Sir Julius Chan signed a contract with British mercenaries to bring some Russian attack helicopters and other equipment to Bougainville. And by March of 1997, a giant Antonov aircraft was transiting through Kuala Lumpur with the equipment destined for Papua New Guinea. The challenge was to stop the weapons arriving and to persuade Chan to consider reasonable alternatives to deliver a settlement on Bougainville. So the NSC sat in regular crisis meetings to determine a course of action, and it determined that the Antonov should be diverted to RAF Base Tyndall, where it went in March 27, 1997. And considered rules of engagement that might be used to force the aircraft to land if necessary. Over a complex and fast-changing situation, Howard used the NSC to shape a government response, shape options, and persuade PNG's pressured leaders to cooperate. Now, with Ian McLaughlin, I later went to Tyndall to inspect the attack helicopters and the 2 transport helicopters that had arrived, along with a large quantity of ammunition. They were badly dilapidated after years of use in Sri Lanka, in Sierra Leone, but still functioning. And had they got to Bougainville, a massacre would have ensued. My recollection is that Howard and his ministers were relieved. They had found out how to operate the levers of national power in Canberra, and the functioning of the NSC was a key to that process. The NSC also had a way of surprising ministers and officials, and not necessarily always on the upside. In February 1998, the NSC discussed options for providing military support to a US-led operation called Desert Thunder, which was to provide a military presence in Kuwait, overflying southern Iraq during negotiations between the UN and Baghdad over weapons of mass destruction. I recall the Prime Minister's quiet astonishment to be briefed by the Chief of Defence Force at an NSC meeting that combat aircraft could not be deployed because they lacked the right level of electronic warfare self-protection systems. And then it was Defence's turn to be surprised when the NSC agreed to deploy a squadron of the Special Air Service Regiment to act as a rescue force if Iraq shot down a coalition aircraft. This was clearly not an option that Defence thought would be taken up. And I recall receiving a phone call from a very angry Deputy Secretary asking if the expletive deleted NSC didn't realise that these forces could be killed or wounded. The risk was in fact very much part of the committee's deliberation. Now, the East Timor crisis starting in 1999, I think, best exemplified the role of the NSC as a crisis management mechanism. But a critical precursor to the crisis, a letter from John Howard to Indonesian President B.J. Habibi sent in November 1998, illustrates, I think, the limits of even well-managed bureaucratic processes. Howard considered that Habibi's replacement of President Suharto and his apparent willingness to consider an autonomy package for East Timor created a possibility to resolve the long-standing conflict between Indonesia and Timorese separatists. Howard's letter to Habibi described by Deputy Prime Minister Tim Fischer as the most important letter ever written during the coalition government's period of office, leading to the creation of East Timor, never went to Cabinet. The letter proposed to Habibi that he considered a review mechanism providing a means of addressing the East Timor desire for an act of self-determination in a manner which avoids an early and final decision on the future status of the province. The mercurial Habibi reacted to the letter by instituting steps for a referendum in East Timor just the following year in August of 1999. Now, in his autobiography, Howard points to an NSC discussion on Timor's status on the 1st of December 98, but the contents of the letter, in particular the idea for an act of self-determination, were developed by Howard in discussion with Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. Key departments like Defence were not consulted. Did this amount to a failure of process? I think not so. Howard notes that the Canberra consensus firmly supported the status quo with East Timor, remaining incorporated in the Indonesian Republic. It was not thought appropriate, he said, to question Indonesian sovereignty over East Timor. So had the letter been part of the standard NSC process, it's likely the bureaucracy would have recommended against sending it. But that said, the letter did produce better outcomes. An independent East Timor, it ended the international opprobrium over Jakarta's occupation and has since allowed for generally better bilateral relations between Canberra and Jakarta. So my overall conclusion is that the NSC, perhaps like all policy clearinghouses, works best at incremental policy change. Major shifts in policy tend to come from reactions to strategic shocks, or indeed from a Prime Minister with a small inner circle looking to make formative change. Now, in the build-up to and during the deployment of the Interfet Stabilisation Force in September 1999, the NSC established a battle rhythm of meeting twice a day, once early in the morning and again in the evening to assess developments. And Defence and the wider bureaucratic system organised itself around that procedure quite comfortably, servicing the government's information requirements and building the international coalition. The practices that were established during the early months of the East Timor crisis were repeated for later military operations in the Solomon Islands, Iraq, Afghanistan, redeployments into Timor-Leste, and many disaster response activities in the Indo-Pacific. My view is that the NSC works well as a mechanism to position the Prime Minister as the first among equals at the table, and therefore the personal work habits, quirks and interests of the Prime Minister give shape to the success or failure of the NSC's processes. Now, there were at times during those military operations occasions when the ADF chafed at the capacity of the NSC to reach right into the tactical heart of military operations. This is not how the operational art was, or indeed still is, taught at the Command and Staff College. The military hope is that governments will give them a desired end state and then leave the commanders to shape the operation. The reality is that the Prime Minister and ministers want to know the minute-by-minute action of operations. Howard's management of the Iraq and Afghanistan deployments following 9/11 enabled the NSC to slip back into a rhythm of meetings and decisions that provided sound management of these operations, particularly in their early years. In his autobiography, Howard is unambiguous that the key decision for Australia immediately after 9/11 was the extent to which we would support the United States through the ANZUS alliance. I did not then, and I still don't think that we had an option not to be militarily involved, and would still expect that Washington would actively support an alliance with Australia. But perhaps a collective failure of the NSC and the wider national security system was not to anticipate that coalitions of forces entering into Afghanistan and then later to Iraq would likely have to face a long and disastrous occupation. To my recollection, that risk was not seriously contemplated. there was a deep interest in intelligence reporting about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, which ultimately turned on Saddam Hussein's bizarre choice to deny international verification of what we soon all discovered, which was that there were no significant chemical or biological programs and nothing on nuclear weapons. As for the longer haul, Australia and the wider coalition suffered from a failure of strategic imagination. The NSC needed more access to contrary voices. And I think here's another lesson about decision-making machinery for military operations. A successfully running machine doesn't function well with discordant inputs. So the government wanted to deliver their alliance objectives, and Defence wanted to shape a deliverable set of operational activities that could be said to underpin the government's objectives. For all of the evident international failings of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, Howard achieved his key strategic objective, which was to build a closer alliance relationship with the United States. In 2022, that is an even more critical strategic objective, and it has to be said that the NSC was the central mechanism enabling Howard to steer that objective. I do wonder, though, if that risk of NSC falling into a sort of steady bureaucratic groupthink might also have led Mr. Howard to another decision which he took around the 2001 timeframe, which was the creation of the institute that I ran for many years, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Because if you recall, ASPI was there to provide contestability of policy advice, a different view about what should be happening in the defence and security world, separate from the wider national security organisation. Now, just very briefly to wrap up, I wanted to mention the role of the NSC in non-crisis management. Under Howard, the committee became the essential decision-making body for defence policy development, like the 2000 Defence White Paper, and also for military capability and acquisition decisions. This was valuable training, I think, both for the bureaucracy, but also for Mr. Howard and the senior ministers, many of whom spent years in their portfolios and built a formidable practical experience that was certainly the equal of the secretaries, agency heads, and senior ADF personnel who attended the NSC. Having worked through the Timor experience and the white paper development that followed it, Howard never felt the need to produce another defence white paper. He had thought through the issues. Speaking of a minister's relationship with the defence organisation, Brendan Nelson said that the relationship needs to be a compact of mutual commitment and responsibility. In most cases, I, Brendan Nelson, took up the cause of the ADF and department with everything I could muster, accepting their advice and running with it. Under John Howard, the NSC became the key instrument for managing this compact of mutual commitment and responsibility between the government and the wider national security community. And since 2007, successive Prime Ministers have chosen the same management structure. So NSCs, in my view, come to reflect the work habits and styles of their chair, the Prime Minister. The system is far from flawless, but it enables an effective engagement of political leadership and administrative expertise. Howard's judgment in his autobiography was that the consistency and discipline the Howard government displayed regarding the foreign policy and defence was due overwhelmingly to the effective way in which the NSC operated. And on balance, I share that judgment. I think that the NSC reflected that committees are only as consistent and disciplined as their members, but that is how the NSC operated during Howard's time as Prime Minister. I'll finish there. Thank you.